In the land that calls itself the cradle of freedom, something sinister was stirring. Quiet, calculated, cloaked in civility. Behind closed doors and beneath layers of legalese, a new voting bill crept its way into legislative chambers. Its language was neutral, but its impact? Devastating. This wasn't just a bill, it was a scalpel, cutting away at the very heart of black and brown civic power. Disguised as election integrity, it targeted the same communities who've always had to fight to be heard. Drop boxes, early voting, mail-in ballots, suddenly security risks. Rural counties, funded. Urban ones, scrutinized. The ink wasn't dry, but the consequences were already bleeding through. And while the nation slept, a storm gathered in a cold marble chamber of Congress. The kind of storm that doesn't start with thunder, but with silence. Jasmine Crockett was in that room, and she was about to speak for the people the bill hoped to erase. Before we get too deep, tap like and subscribe if stories like this keep you up thinking. And if you're watching right now, drop your state and the time you're tuning in. We want to know who's still awake with us. Dim the lights. Turn down the world. This is where the silence breaks. The chamber was freezing, literally and figuratively. The kind of cold that crept into your bones, not from the thermostat, but from the energy of the room. Polished marble walls reflected the sterile glow of overhead lights. Cameras were mounted like silent witnesses, blinking red as they streamed the performance to the world. It wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like a trial. Not a trial of law, but of legitimacy, of who got to define democracy and who was just tolerated in its halls. Senator Mitch McConnell sat centered at the head of the long oak table like an emperor carved in gray stone. His face unreadable. His hands folded neatly like this was just another formality. Another day of quietly directing the levers of power. 40 years in Washington had taught him to weaponize patience. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room already belonged to him. To his left and right were aides, stiff in suits, their expressions carefully neutral. Behind them, lobbyists and bureaucrats scribbled notes, adjusted glasses, and exchanged glances. They weren't just passing a bill. They were shaping history, and not everyone in the room was supposed to have a hand on the pen. Across from them, almost in the shadows, sat Representative Jasmine Crockett. No one announced her arrival. No camera lingered too long, but her presence carried its own kind of weight, unshakable, unwavering. Her hands rested on a manila folder, filled not just with papers, but with stories, names, data, receipts. She wore a dark blazer, unassuming yet sharp, like armor, tailored in purpose. Her earrings glinted beneath the fluorescent lights, small, gold, deliberate. She didn't fidget, she didn't smile, but every inch of her posture said, I am not afraid of this room, because Jasmine Crockett had grown up knowing rooms like this were never built for people like her. But she also knew something they didn't. She didn't come to ask permission. The hearing was called under the pretense of streamlining election policy across state lines, a coordinated effort, some said, to modernize democracy. But Jasmine had already read between the lines. The proposed bill, cloaked in technocratic language, had one function: suppression. Early voting would be shortened by 10 days. Mail-in voting eligibility would tighten under new ID standards. Sunday voting, beloved in black churches through souls to the polls, would be virtually eliminated. Dropbox access in dense urban areas, reduced to 1 per county. In Harris County, that meant 1 box for over 4 million residents. She'd highlighted these lines. She'd annotated the footnotes. She knew this wasn't reform, it was regression. And every person in this room knew it too. They just didn't think she'd say it out loud. McConnell leaned forward, clearing his throat. The cameras tilted toward him with subconscious loyalty. He began his remarks like he always did, soft, measured, with the practiced tone of someone who's used to being believed. We are here today, he said, not to limit voting, but to ensure its integrity. A few heads nodded, a few pens moved. This bill simply ensures uniformity, that no matter where you live, whether in rural Kentucky or urban Chicago, the standards are the same. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't blink. She simply listened. He continued, It is our duty to prevent voter fraud before it happens, not to wait for disaster and then react. The people deserve security in their democratic process. What he said sounded reasonable. Until you considered the facts, there was no evidence of widespread fraud. Not in 2020, not before, but fear didn't need facts. It just needed airtime. McConnell offered a final line. I understand some have concerns, but this isn't about race. It's about rules. And the rules, Representative Crockett, are colorblind. And there it was. Jasmine exhaled, quiet, controlled. She looked around the room, scanning each face. Some were locked in political theater, others in complicity. But one thing was clear. Nobody expected her to challenge this directly. They were hoping she'd make a statement, get her soundbite, and move on. But Jasmine wasn't here for soundbites. She was here to expose the script. At that moment, the silence in the room shifted. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. People adjusted in their chairs. The tension felt like static, clinging to the corners. Her hand moved slowly to open the folder. And for the first time, someone at the table, not a camera, not an aide, noticed her eyes. They weren't angry. They weren't pleading. They were focused, steady, relentless. The kind of look that says, you may think this is your stage, but I came to burn down the curtain. And somewhere deep down, McConnell felt it. He didn't show it, but his fingers curled tighter on the table's edge. Because what Jasmine Crockett was about to do wasn't politics. It was revelation. Senator McConnell didn't slam the table. He didn't point fingers. He didn't need to. In Washington, the most dangerous insults don't come with raised voices. They come dressed in manners. He leaned forward just slightly, voice soft and polished like marble. It was the voice of someone used to having the final word, not because he shouted, but because the system echoed him. Representative Crockett, he began, using her title like a scalpel, I appreciate your passion. I do. The concern for your community is admirable. The pause after your was intentional, long enough to isolate, but short enough to deny. You know, he continued, smiling with the smugness of someone who believes they're untouchable. When I first read your comments to the press last week, I couldn't help but think, maybe this is just a misunderstanding. Maybe you're misinterpreting the intent here, because this bill doesn't mention race. It doesn't target anyone. The way he said mention and target carried a buried sneer, like a professor correcting a wayward student in front of the class. The kind who knows the truth, but prefers to shame the student into silence. We're simply ensuring that elections are secure, that ballots aren't just being passed around in inner-city neighborhoods without verification, he said, eyes darting just briefly across the room, then back to her. That all Americans, not just the loudest ones, can trust the outcome. Inner city, loudest, words that meant something else without him ever saying it directly. Dog whistles in full surround sound. He adjusted his glasses, feigning thoughtfulness. I've reviewed your concerns, but to be honest, I think you're focusing too much on race. Again, not everything is about race. There it was. Again, the quiet violence of dismissal. The implication that naming injustice was worse than committing it. That if she spoke for black and brown voters, she was being divisive. That if she pointed to history, she was living in the past. That if she felt the sting of systemic neglect, then surely it was just a feeling. I get it, he said, shaking his head lightly. We all want to feel like we're doing something meaningful, especially those of us who come from less traditional political backgrounds. That one landed hard. But because Jasmine didn't come from a dynasty. She came from South Dallas, from the Night Court, from jail visits and civil rights lawsuits. She'd fought systems from the outside before stepping inside them. And now he was painting her like an emotional outsider. Unqualified, reactive, angry, ghetto adjacent. You've built a reputation, strong rhetoric, sharp responses, he said. And that's fine for the evening news or a Twitter clip. But this is policy. It's nuanced. It's the Lomo, not slogans. Not slogans, not protests, not chants in the street. Frankly, Representative, I worry sometimes that we're giving too much weight to emotional narratives. We need data, not anecdotes about people who claim they couldn't get IDs or find polling places. The room was still, but not quiet, because underneath the silence was something simmering, resentment dressed as a regulation. I was raised to believe that if you wanted something in this country, you worked for it. You didn't wait for the government to hand it to you. We can't keep bending rules for every sob story about how hard it is to vote when half the time they just don't want to get off the couch and go to work. He said it without blinking, and the subtext was crystal clear. They meant those people who live in bad neighborhoods, people on food stamps, people whose addresses change because rent does, people who, in his mind, didn't earn the ballot. They inherited it like a welfare check. And then, as if casually, he dropped it. Honestly, if I had a nickel for every so-called voter who claimed they were disenfranchised, I'd be rich enough to fund 100 campaigns. But you don't hear those folks talking about personal responsibility. It's always the system's fault. Always the same old ghetto grievances. Ghetto grievances, not policy disagreements, not statistical disparities, but grievances. From the ghetto. He didn't say thug. He didn't have to. He didn't say welfare queen. But the ghost of Reagan echoed in the walls. Jasmine sat still, unmoved. Because this was the script she'd seen before. Polished contempt hidden behind procedural language. They didn't yell at you in these halls. They smiled. They said, "You people," with a handshake. And still, Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. Because her power wasn't in matching venom with venom. It was in patience, in precision, in the long game. And that silence, that stillness, it was just the wind pulling back before the storm. There are moments in politics when silence isn't absent. It's strategy. And in that marble room, beneath the fluorescent lights and condescension, Jasmine Crockett sat still. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she had everything to say. And when you're holding truth like dynamite, you don't toss it too early. The air was thick with the scent of smugness. McConnell leaned back in his chair, pleased. He thought he'd controlled the narrative, that he'd painted her as just another angry black woman, one with a loud voice but no facts. A reaction, not a threat. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even adjust her folder. That stillness wasn't submission. It was a calculation. Because she had seen this game before on courthouse steps in Texas, in legislative sessions where they called poverty a lifestyle choice, in subcommittees where they pretended not to notice that the only people cut out of budgets were black and brown. So now she waited, let him talk, let him bury himself in coded language and moral superiority. She'd learned long ago, when a man thinks you're not dangerous, he shows you everything. Inside, her mind raced, not with panic, but precision. She replayed his words, inner city neighborhoods. Too focused on race. Ghetto grievances. Every phrase logged, every syllable tucked into memory, like bricks she'd stack later for a public reckoning. She didn't need to twist his meaning. He had already done the work for her. Her eyes scanned the room, not just the men at the table, but the aides in the back. The interns looked away when he said, "Those folks," the clerk whose pen paused when ghetto hit the air like a slap. They weren't just witnesses, they were proof. Proof that silence doesn't mean nobody heard. It just means people are waiting to see who breaks it first. She thought of her father then, a welder, quiet, proud, hands always calloused but steady. He used to tell her, "Baby, when you got truth in your mouth, you don't need to raise your voice. Just open it at the right time." And this wasn't the time. Yet. So she sat, behind her eyes, decades of voter suppression. She remembered 2013, when the Supreme Court gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, removing the pre-clearance requirement for states with histories of racial discrimination. She'd been a young attorney then, furious, watching Texas implement new voter ID laws within hours of the decision. They said it was about integrity, but her client said otherwise. Single moms, students, veterans who suddenly didn't have the right type of ID. She remembered the names Crystal, who worked double shifts and missed the shorter early voting window. Mr. Howard, 83, turned away after his driver's license expired. Alonzo, who never got the mail-in ballot he requested because his apartment building had too many undeliverable addresses. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. So no, she wasn't overreacting. She was responding to a pattern, a blueprint, an old weapon dressed in a new language. She looked again at McConnell, his calm, calculated posture. He thought he was untouchable, thought the law was his domain and history his ally. But what he didn't know, what he'd never understood, was that the law didn't belong to men like him. It belonged to the people. And Jasmine had come with their stories, their data, their pain, and she'd bound it all into pages of documented fact. She reached down, not fast, not dramatically, and turned the first page of her folder. The sound of paper sliding broke the tension like a pin drop in a church. One of the aides looked up. That was the tell. The room, which had bathed in his voice for the last 15 minutes, began to tilt, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, as if some invisible weight had shifted sides. Still, she didn't speak, not yet, because she didn't just want the truth to be heard. She wanted it to land, to sting where it was supposed to crack the mask they wore so comfortably. Her fingers traced the bolded line on the page. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act prohibits any law that results in racial discrimination, whether intentional or not. That was her anchor, not rhetoric, not outrage, the law. McConnell had underestimated her. He thought she'd come armed with emotion and Twitter fire. But she came with constitutional precedent, statistical breakdowns, legal memos, and something he could never counterfeit, lived experience. And now, as the room waited, unsure, unsettled, unable to name what had just shifted, Jasmine quietly closed her folder. She didn't need to yell. The storm was already here. It just hadn't spoken yet. The folder clicked open. Quiet, intentional. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't clear her throat. She simply began. And the room leaned in. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, she said, her tone measured, deliberate, prohibits any voting practice or procedure that results in discrimination on the basis of race, color, or language minority status, even if that result wasn't intended. She paused, letting that phrase settle. Even if that result wasn't intended. Then she lifted her eyes, not just toward McConnell, but toward the cameras, the aides, the record keepers, and the millions who would watch later from couches and barbershops and church pews. This bill doesn't have to say black to target black voters, she said. It just needs to do what this one does. She slid the first document across the table. Page 12, subsection C, reduction of early voting days from 14 to 4. 4 days, she said. That's all that would be left. And guess which communities use early voting the most? Majority black counties. Working class neighborhoods where people hold 2 jobs, where standing in line for 5 hours on a Tuesday just isn't an option. She slid another page, then another, like laying cards down in a game where she knew the deck had been stacked, but she had memorized every number. Voter ID requirements. This bill accepts hunting licenses, but not student IDs. She raised an eyebrow. If this is about security, why does it favor one type of citizen over another? Why does it trust a gun owner but not a nursing student? McConnell shifted in his seat. Drop box restrictions. 1 box per county, not per 1,000 voters, not per zip code, just 1. She tapped the map laid out beside her. In Harris County, that's 1 drop box for over 4 million people. Meanwhile, in rural counties with 10,000 residents, same number. That's not standardization. That's sabotage. But only if your zip code starts with the wrong digit. There was no sound in the room now. No cough, no rustle, no whispers from staffers, just the relentless rhythm of evidence. Then came the pivot. Jasmine leaned forward, not in aggression, but in intention. If this bill isn't about race, she said, then why does every impact fall on the same people, in the same communities, in the same way, decade after decade? She let the silence answer, and then, like a blade wrapped in velvet, she followed with, "Senator, you said earlier that the law must be colorblind, but I ask you, if a law is blind to its consequences, is it still just?" McConnell opened his mouth, then closed it. No rebuttal came, so she continued, "I bought data, but I also brought names." She unfolded a list, handwritten, personal, humans. Denise Grant, I am 64 years old. Voted in every election since 1972. Got turned away in the last one because she moved apartments and her address hadn't updated in time under the new rules. She held up Denise's voter card. Raymond Ellis, Gulf War vet, lost access to transportation after his license expired. The closest polling place in his district under this bill, 13 miles away. Pause. This bill doesn't ban voting for black and brown people. It just makes it a marathon, while white suburban counties get a smooth paved walkway. She turned toward the cameras now. And we're supposed to be okay with that because it doesn't use racial slurs, because it says integrity on the cover? She leaned back, her tone cooling, but her eyes heating. If a fire burns down your house, does it matter if it was arson or accidental neglect? Your home is still gone. She closed the folder. The silence was no longer awkward. It was heavy, guilty, exposed. Jasmine folded her hands. I am not here to make speeches, she said. I'm here to protect the people who elected me, people who've had to memorize voting laws like escape plans, just to have a voice. This bill doesn't defend democracy. It dismantles it, piece by bureaucratic piece. Then her voice dropped low, deliberate, like a final note before a verdict. And if it takes one calm black woman in this cold room to say what everybody else is afraid to say out loud, then let me say it plainly. She looked McConnell in the eye. This bill doesn't protect voting. It protects power. And it does so by preying on those you think won't fight back. And just like that, the energy in the room shifted. Not with applause, not with gasps, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that means someone finally told the truth. For the first time in a very long time, Mitch McConnell didn't have the next move. The man who had built a career on stillness, on saying less than necessary, found himself sitting in a silence that wasn't strategic. It was suffocating. Jasmine Crockett's words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The data, the law, the names, it was airtight, unshakable. And worse, it had been delivered with a calm he couldn't dismiss. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene. She had simply told the truth. And that made it impossible to discredit. McConnell shifted in his chair, just slightly, but it was enough. He cleared his throat. Once. Twice. Well, Representative, he said finally, his voice thinner now, I can appreciate your perspective. Perspective. Like the law was a mood. Like history was a matter of opinion. He leaned forward again, but this time the posture felt different. Defensive, not dominant. But this narrative of oppression, he said, fingers now tapping slowly against the wood, is becoming a bit repetitive. We keep hearing that every reform is an attack, that every change is somehow racist. It's exhausting. The words were chosen carefully, but his tone was cracking. He continued, Look, I've been in public service longer than most of the people in this room have been alive, and I've worked with civil rights leaders, real ones, men who didn't just throw around buzzwords for headlines. There it was, the jab, the implication that she wasn't a real leader, that she was a performer. Not like the good ones, the ones who stayed in line, the ones who negotiated quietly behind closed doors instead of calling out injustice under the lights. He glanced toward the cameras, more aware of them now. And let's not pretend the bill is some grand conspiracy plan, he added. This is about restoring confidence in our elections. People, real, hard-working Americans, are concerned. They see cities like Chicago, Atlanta, Philadelphia, and they worry. He didn't say it, but everyone heard it. Cities like code. Just like welfare fraud is code. Just like inner-city crime, law and order, urban decay. And then it happened. Something in his voice rose. The tone slipped from composed senator to cornered patriarch. You want to talk about fairness? Let's talk about personal responsibility. You can't expect the system to bend over backwards for every voter who forgets their ID or can't read a ballot. That's not discrimination. That's dysfunctional. He laughed once. Bitter. I mean, hell, how long are we going to keep pretending that every story about some hood rat not finding a polling place is a civil rights crisis? The room frozen. No one spoke. Even the aides, the loyal assistants who had spent years perfecting the art of neutral expressions, blinked. McConnell didn't seem to notice. He pressed on, his voice growing sharper, faster, more raw than rehearsed. This whole thing, you act like there's some master plan to suppress votes, as if we're all sitting in smoke-filled rooms plotting how to stop people from casting ballots. No, you know what's really happening? We're trying to bring order, to stop chaos. Because frankly, some of these districts have turned voting into a free-for-all. No rules, no timelines, just vibes. He almost spat the word, vibes. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the cameras were still rolling, and the whole country would soon hear him say hood rat with a straight face. And just like that, the mask cracked. Because you can call it frustration. You can call it a slip. You can call it a moment of human error. But what it really was the truth. The truth that had always lingered beneath the surface of these bills, these hearings, these committee speeches about security and integrity. The truth that all the law degrees and flag pins and founding father quotes couldn't hide forever. A belief that some Americans are more American than others. That some people, because of their skin, their zip code, their income, their accent, should have to work twice as hard just to vote once. McConnell saw the shift then, not in Jasmine. She remained poised, but in the room, in the way the interns no longer looked down at their notes, in the way the stenographer's fingers slowed, in the way one side, his own aide, briefly looked up, eyes wide, a breath caught. He tried to pivot, tried to regain control. All I'm saying is, we have to stop bending laws to accommodate every complaint from people who don't even understand the process. They think the government owes them access to everything on a silver platter. Bootstraps used to mean something in this country. He was spiraling now, jumping from cliches to caricatures. Bootstraps, welfare, hood rats, inner cities. The talking points of a man backed into a corner, forced to reveal the foundation beneath his politics. Fear. Fear of change. Fear of accountability. Fear that power once shared might no longer answer him. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. Because sometimes silence doesn't just hold power. Sometimes it amplifies weakness. It started with a blink. A video clip only 47 seconds long surfaced on a small TikTok account run by a 22-year-old poli-sci student from Howard University. The caption read, "Did this man just say hood rat during a congressional hearing?" Within hours, the internet lit up like dry leaves under lightning. By midnight, the clip had crossed over to Twitter, now X, where #HoodRatHearing trended at number 2 nationwide. On Instagram, it was reposted with a side-by-side of McConnell's face and a quote bubble that read, "Bootstraps used to mean something." The comments flooded in. "I've heard that voice my whole life, in courtrooms, in offices, in schools. Jasmine just made the world hear it too." You can't hide that kind of contempt behind a flag pin anymore. But it wasn't just the usual digital chorus. Something different was happening. Local news outlets in Texas picked up the story first. Then CNN, then MSNBC, then Roland Martin's morning show. Clips of Jasmine calmly reciting the Voting Rights Act while McConnell fumbled into racially coded language played on loop. Churches played it from pulpits on Sunday. College professors played it in political science lectures Monday morning. High school teachers in Detroit, Atlanta, Baltimore, and Jackson passed it to their civics classes. It wasn't just viral, it was visceral, because this wasn't about two politicians disagreeing. This was about a system being seen for what it had always been. Still, the pushback came fast and funded. A coordinated wave of pundits flooded conservative radio and cable panels. "He didn't say anything racist," one Fox anchor declared. "He was making a point about order, about working hard. These people are just race baiting again." "They twist words," another said on talk radio. "He said hood rat, Not that word. Big difference. Behind the scenes, conservative PACs paid influencers to push counter-narratives. Right-wing pages blasted Facebook ads. They're silencing our voices to protect feelings. Support the Voting Integrity Act before it's too late. Bots were deployed. Fake accounts tweeted from anonymous handles, parroting the same lines. I'm black, and I agree with McConnell. He's just speaking facts. But the lie didn't stick, because real people were finally seeing something that had been hiding in plain sight. And the people who knew the truth, those who had lived it, were louder than they had ever been before. In Selma, Alabama, a 75-year-old woman named Loretta Gaines pulled out an old Polaroid of her father marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965. She posted it online and with one sentence. He fought for this. I'm watching Jasmine Crockett finish what he started. In Detroit, a local barbershop turned off ESPN and turned on C-SPAN replays of the hearing. Men who hadn't voted in years sat in silence, watching Jasmine's face as McConnell unraveled. In Miami, a high schooler named Jaquan printed out Jasmine's quotes and plastered them across the school hallway bulletin board under a hand-lettered sign. If they won't teach us, we'll teach each other. Across TikTok, young black women stitched Jasmine's calm delivery with their own commentary. This is what it looks like when you walk in truth and don't flinch. She didn't have to scream. Her facts screamed for her. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations, NAACP, Color of Change, Black Voters Matter, called emergency press conferences. Not to defend Jasmine, but to amplify her, because she didn't need defending. The truth was on tape. They rolled out statistics, district maps, legal briefs. One graph showed the dramatic drop in voter turnout in majority black counties after voter ID laws in 2014. Another showed polling place closures since Shelby County Ver. Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, predominantly in black and Latino neighborhoods. This wasn't anecdotal, it was systemic. It was planned, and now it was exposed. But the backlash wasn't only digital. Threats poured into Jasmine's congressional office. Emails filled with slurs, voicemails muttering, "You'll regret speaking up." One caller said, "You need to remember your place." She didn't flinch. In fact, that Monday morning, Jasmine Crockett stood on the steps of her local community center. Center, not in D.C., but in South Dallas. Surrounded by elders, activists, and young organizers, she spoke directly to the cameras again. "I don't fear backlash," she said. "I fear silence, because silence has cost us too much." And with that, the tide fully turned, because this wasn't about McConnell anymore. He was no longer the center. This was about voice, about presence, about history refusing to be erased again. The nation didn't just listen to Jasmine. The nation heard itself. And for the first time in a long time, the volume of truth was louder than the power of denial. It didn't come with a mic drop. There was no dramatic pause, no pounding on the table, no thunderclap of applause. It came the way truth usually comes. Soft, certain, and impossible to unhear. Jasmine Crockett looked up, steady as stone, her voice as measured as ever. If protecting democracy means silencing black voters, then what you're protecting isn't democracy, it's power. For half a second, the room didn't move. Then someone's pen stopped mid-stroke. A staffer inhaled sharply but didn't exhale. A single camera light blinked. And somewhere across the country, someone watching alone in their living room whispered, "Who ate that again?" By morning, the clip had 3 million views. By noon, it passed 10. By the end of the week, it had hit 20 million, and that was just the original post. It didn't matter if you were tuned into C-SPAN or TikTok. It was everywhere. People were quoting it in sermons, writing it on protest signs, painting it on murals. It became a TikTok sound, a Twitter header, a Spotify interlude. A rapper from Atlanta sampled the line and dropped it over a boom-bap beat that trended within hours. College students printed it on hoodies. Teachers used it as an opening line for civics class. One little girl in Milwaukee recited it to her father after school and asked, "Is Jasmine the boss of the Senate now?" And because that one sentence, it wasn't just eloquent, it was surgical. It split the room, cut clean through decades of euphemism, deflection, and manufactured talking points. It stripped away the buzzwords: election integrity, ballot confidence, uniform procedure. It tore the polite mask off political gaslighting. And underneath, power. Not the power of the people, not the power of justice, but the power to exclude, to gatekeeper, to erase. And Jasmine had called it out. Not with rage, but with clarity. Not with fury, but with fact. CNN ran a special segment, Democracy versus Power, the line that changed the debate. MSNBC looped the clip with subtitles and cut-ins of voter suppression data, showing the chilling consistency across states: Georgia, Texas, Florida, and Mississippi. Late-night hosts didn't even joke. They just played the sentence, and then came the response from everyday people. That line's going to be in history books. That line said what my grandmother tried to tell me when I was 13 and didn't understand why she cried the day she first voted. That line is why I'm registering to vote this year. That line was written on fire. The quote made its way into places no bill could reach. In a charter school in Philadelphia, a black student council president asked to read Jasmine's quote over the intercom at morning announcements. In a church basement in Birmingham, a choir sang it softly over a Hammond organ before launching into A Change Is Gonna Come. In Los Angeles, a street artist painted Jasmine's face on the side of a bus stop, her mouth mid-sentence, and above it, in bold red, "It's not democracy if only some of us get to speak." And in Washington, someone had quietly stenciled the sentence on the back wall of a congressional hallway in chalk before security wiped it off. But by the next day, it was back, in paint. The pushback came, of course. Always does. One Fox commentator tried to mock it. She says it's about democracy, but what she really wants is control. Another congressman tweeted, "Power is what happens when one side calls disagreement oppression." But it was too late, because Jasmine hadn't just spoken the truth. She'd exposed the contrast. On one side, a system trying to tighten its grip. On the other, a woman, calm and unshaken, naming the thing that could no longer hide behind civility. She hadn't accused anyone of being a racist. She had just made them uncomfortable with the result of their rules. And for a country built on freedom, that was enough to shake the ground. In a documentary film 6 months later, a journalist asked Jasmine Crockett if she'd planned that sentence. She smiled gently and said, "No, I plan to defend the people." The words just followed the truth. That line, the one that turned hearings into headlines, that transformed whispers into war cries, didn't just make Jasmine Crockett a political force. It made her a mirror, one the country couldn't look away from. In Washington, when power loses, it doesn't scream, it retreats, quietly, strategically, like a shadow slipping behind a thicker wall. 2 weeks after the hearing, the voting bill was pulled from the legislative calendar. No press release, no official apology, just a vague memo citing pending revisions and interagency review. Translation? They got caught. But outside the Capitol walls, something very different was happening. Because while the bill had quietly died in committee, the movement didn't. It breathed. In Dallas, on a warm Saturday morning, Jasmine Crockett returned home. Not to hold a press conference, not to claim victory, but to listen. She stood at a neighborhood town hall in South Oak Cliff, surrounded by folding chairs and elders with voter registration forms in their laps. There was no grand entrance, just her, in jeans and sneakers, hugging people who now saw her as more than a representative. "She said it for us," one man whispered, "and she said it like she ain't scared." In the back corner, a group of teenagers from Lincoln High had made their own Mike Moment t-shirts, screen-printed with Jasmine's face and the quote that shattered a system. If protecting democracy means silencing black voters, they didn't sell them. They handed them out, like armor, like scripture. Across the country, people moved. In Atlanta, black church networks launched Operation 272, a plan to increase black voter turnout by 2.7 million by the next election. The number wasn't arbitrary. It was the estimated number of votes suppressed across key states since 2013, when Shelby County versus Holder gutted the preclearance clause of the Voting Rights Act. In Arizona, a Navajo activist cited Jasmine's hearing during a federal lawsuit challenging ballot access on tribal land. In Milwaukee, barbershops held ballots and fades Saturdays, free cuts, voter registration, and clips of Jasmine on loop. And in Tallahassee, a group of black women attorneys founded the Crockett Collective, a legal team dedicated to challenging voter suppression bills before they pass. Even the mainstream press couldn't ignore it. The New York Times ran a Sunday front-page piece, "The New Standard of Political Resistance, Calm, Relentless, Black Female." A PBS special featured young organizers holding town halls using Jasmine's method. No yelling, no debating identity, just facts, just law, just dignity. And on social media, the shift was seismic. Where once there were endless debates about what counts as racism, there was now a clear blueprint of how it operates. In language, in law, in silence. And people finally were ready to name it. Of course, opposition didn't vanish. Some lawmakers doubled down, pushing new legislation with even more veiled language. Bills that spoke of ballot hygiene and geo-verification zones. But the public was no longer fooled. They'd seen the hearing, they'd heard the sentence, and now they had questions and the courage to ask them. Because Jasmine didn't just win a moment, she created muscle memory. For every kid once told their voice didn't matter. For every elder who stood in line for hours just to be told they brought the wrong ID. For every voter whose district got gerrymandered out of relevance. Jasmine Crockett gave them something they hadn't had in a long time. Proof that truth still works. That the mic doesn't need to be dropped. It just needs to be heard. Months later, in a tiny library in Baton Rouge, a woman named Cassandra sat with her 12-year-old daughter, Aaliyah, as they watched Jasmine's speech on YouTube. When it ended, Aaliyah asked, "Can we go vote?" Her mother smiled, teared up, and whispered, "Not today, baby, but we will. And you'll never forget why." In the end, the bill was just paper. But what rose in its ashes? That was something different, and that was people. And people don't just rise for a policy, they rise for each other. What began as a routine hearing on election policy became something else entirely. Something unshakable. Not because of the bill, not because of the backlash, but because one woman, calm, clear, and grounded in the law, refused to let silence stand in for consent. Jasmine Crockett didn't shut down power. She outlasted it. She outreasoned it. And in doing so, she outshined every lie dressed in politeness. She didn't just expose one bill. She exposed a system that's been telling black and brown voters for decades, "You're not part of the plan, you're just part of the problem." But Jasmine flipped the script with facts, with history, with one sentence that echoed louder than any gavel. If protecting democracy means silencing black voters, then what you're protecting isn't democracy, it's power. That line didn't end the conversation. It started one, and now the bar has been raised, not just for courage, but for what truth sounds like when it's spoken without fear. This isn't about left or right, it's about right and wrong, and the question isn't whether democracy can survive. The question is, who's willing to defend it when the cameras are off and the cost is high? This story is a dramatized and fictionalized account meant to reflect real struggles in modern America. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. Now, before you go, take a breath. And if this story moved you, don't let it end here. Tap like to help stories like this reach those who need to hear them. Subscribe if you want more narratives that challenge power without chasing spectacle. Leave a comment below. Tell us which moment hit you hardest for you. And share this with someone who still believes the quietest people often carry the deepest truths. Because maybe the next Jasmine Crockett isn't in office yet. Maybe she's just waiting for a sign that her voice matters. Maybe she's watching now. And if she is, we hear you, we see you, and we're not looking away.